welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. I am Stephen Robinson. I'm very pleased to welcome today author and pop culture historian Tim English, who I just had the pleasure of reading his book, The Kennedys' New York, American Royalty in the Greatest City in the World. So what it particularly had inspired you to, because you do an extensive amount of research delving into the history of the Kennedys and their time in New York. Obviously the Kennedys historically hail from Massachusetts, but New York has sort of become their chosen homes. So what kind of inspired you to sort of do this deep dive?
I guess, well, like a lot of people, I've grown up just fascinated with the family. I've always followed them. And, when you undertake this project like this, you hope you can bring something new to the table. I mean, there have been so many books written about all the different members of this family that it's a challenge for an author to bring something new to the table. So that's what I tried to do. And I did that with a lot of extensive research, with an eye out for sort of little details and stories that maybe people hadn't heard before, with the goal of really showing how New York played such an essential role in the story of this family. As you mentioned, I mean, it goes back to 1927, and Joe Sr. moved the family to New York. And he did that because he actually told a friend that Boston is no place to raise Irish Catholic children, which is amazing thing had him say for this family that's so identified with Boston. And of course, JFK was a congressman and a senator representing there, and Ted represented Massachusetts for many years. But there it is. He thought that they were prejudiced against Irish Catholics, that it was the old sort of Brahmin, old school Protestants, and they were looked down on, and they couldn't get into some of the clubs and that sort of thing. And Joe preferred New York because he said Wall Street was very much a meritocracy, where it didn't matter so much who your parents were and things like that, but you had your own smarts and wherewithal to get ahead. So that's where he wanted to raise his children. They moved to Riverdale section of the Bronx in 1927. 2 years later, they moved to Bronxville section of Westchester County. And JFK was, I guess, 10 when they moved. So we really had his formative years growing up as a New Yorker. And he was never far from New York, from Manhattan, for the rest of his life. As I say, the story goes back a long way. And, the New York's role in this story is really what I tried to bring out in the book.
And specifically, Robert Kennedy Jr. is obviously quite in the news right now, but his father was, a senator from New York, and that history again goes way back in that sense of like almost it's sort of as much as you say as much a political center as Massachusetts. I mean, Ted Kennedy was from there, but really it was sort of really was a sort of chosen home for them. And it's interesting you mentioned that kind of, now it might seem strange that Irish Catholics would not be welcome in Boston, but yes, at the time that definitely was the case. And some of the stuff that I found is interesting. So the Upper East Side Hotel, when JFK said a final goodbye to his 20-year-old mistress in November of 1963, which would also be the site of JFK Jr.'s secret meeting with Princess Diana decades later. That's such a weird coincidence.
Junior did not have a fling with Diana, as far as we know. So that
yes, there's a secret. The secret meeting is yes, it's a much more polite secret meeting. I had always thought this was a myth. It apparently the Midtown Theater where Jackie Kennedy viewed the X-rated film I Am Curious Yellow in 1969. How do you sort of track that down? Like, how do you know that it's both? This is the theater, and that it's even still there. Sort of interesting.
It is still there. Yeah, it's called the Directors Guild Theater now, which is a prominent place for like industry events and things like that. But as far as the story goes, it was documented. I mean, it was in the Daily News the next day. And it was funny because Jackie put on the sunglasses and she had like a kerchief over her, sort of like trying to go incognito and hoping not to be recognized as she went to this movie. Now, this was fall of '69, so this is before Last Tango and all that, and sort of where these adult X-rated movies became a little more mainstream. So she was trying to kind of down low it. She went in there with Ari, but she went out in the lobby, and then a photographer recognized her and started taking photos. And she made a quick exit, leaving Ari to finish the rest of the movie by himself. And but she actually, a photographer, sort of got knocked down in the melee outside. There was sort of a scuffle outside. The photographer claiming that Jackie had pushed him down. Another witness said that didn't happen. But yeah, I mean, I just kind of a cool story. I mean, this woman, she was a young woman when she became a widow. She was only 34, I believe. And, she was not gonna, at some point, she had a year or so in mourning, but then she, resumed her social life and did, things you would expect a young woman to be doing. And that was one of them.
And it's interesting. It's a tragic story, obviously, with JFK Jr.'s death. I was in New York at the time when that occurred, and I've said it was sort of one of the last kind of feelings that, even beyond politics, it felt that everyone was feeling this loss. There was a lot of people, my generation, I think even older, who really had their own sort of aspirations for JFK Jr., fair or not, of what his future would be. And I think you sort of kind of follow all these spots where he was, or, both in his career when he was building up the magazine George, but also like the restaurant on West 51st Street where he, literally ate his last meal. And I think you describe the situation of how he wound up piloting the aircraft and how it could have gone a different way.
Well, yeah, I guess you could put any event under a microscope, like how two people meet and, maybe they go on to have a relationship and start a family, and all the ifs that have to go into that. If that they met whatever time they did, if somebody had left the event earlier, they wouldn't have been there. And certainly with the tragedy with John and Carolyn and Lauren in that plane crash, there were all these maybe 10 or 15 factors in it that if you take one out, it would not have happened. You could start with the fact that he had his cast removed the day before at Lenox Hill Hospital. If that had happened the following week, he probably would have had an instructor with him. There's also the fact that an instructor called him at George around noon that Friday and said, "Hey, you want me to go with you?" And he said, "No, I'm going to go it alone." That doesn't happen. They probably are not in that crash. And on and on. The traffic in New York, the fact that they both got delayed leaving the city that Friday afternoon. Was a Friday afternoon in the summer. Anybody that's lived in New York or been around New York knows to deal with that. There's a very bad amount of traffic. And you have the weather as a factor, and just the fact that why Lauren was there was probably down to the fact that they were fighting. There were some issues in the marriage. They had breakfast at the Stanhope, where John had been living the last few days, up on Fifth Avenue, not far from Jackie's home at 1045th. And Warren was sort of playing peacemaker. Said, "Come on, I'll go along." She was trying to talk Carolyn into going because it would have looked bad. John was going to his cousin's, Rory's, wedding, and it would have looked really bad if Carolyn hadn't gone, and would have sort of publicized whatever problems they were having. So Lauren went as a peacemaker, said, "Come on, I'll go too. It'll be great. It'll be fun." So Carolyn said, "Oh, okay." But if Lauren hadn't gone, maybe Carolyn wouldn't have gone. But if it was just the two of them, they wouldn't have made the detour out over the ocean to Martha's Vineyard, because Lauren wanted to be dropped off there. And that was the reason for that detour, instead of hugging the coast and going right up to Cape Cod, where the wedding was at Hyannisport. So, it's just so many factors that contributed to this really awful thing. And as you said, Stephen, when he died, it was more than just, the tragedy. It was, he was sort of like a member of the family. I mean, the whole country actually knew him even before he was born,
Hmm.
because his father was elected president just a few weeks before he was born. And then, everything the family had been through, and, a lot of people had hopes for him too, which was probably a burden to carry. First having the name, and then the expectations that one day he's going to run for president. Oh, by the way, your father was assassinated in the street when he had the same job. Why don't you do that too? So uh, it was a complicated legacy, but. And he had people throw the word surreal around. They tried to let the readers sort of be in the shoes of these people, whether it was at the various places or just trying to demonstrate what their lives were like. And I had a account from the writer Jack Newfield, who went to a place called the Judson Grill near George Magazine with John for lunch one day, and he just talked about how like surreal or weird it was to be with him. Everybody is paying attention to him. Everybody, all the women are looking at him, staring at him, smiling. All the waiters are nervous. Everybody at the restaurant is trying to listen in, trying to hear what he's saying. So he couldn't really conduct any kind of real conversation because everybody was listening in, trying to hear. And he thought to himself, how strange, to live your life this way. Of course, John never knew a time when he wasn't famous, but still, I mean, and then, in marrying Carolyn, I think, John had been used to dealing with the media. I think his thing was, give them a little bit and then hope they go away. Try to make nice with them and maybe they'll go away. Carolyn had a much different experience being sort of a civilian thrust into that
Hmm.
spotlight. And people said, well, she knew what she was getting into. Yeah, yes and no. I mean, yeah, she knew she was marrying a very famous man, but it seemed like all that attention ramped up when they got married, maybe partly because the paparazzi thought they'd been had because John pulled off the wedding without anybody knowing about it. It was like a top secret operation down on that island off the coast of Georgia. And maybe there was a little resentment, but they, if anything, even though John asked them, hey, can you cool it? She's not used to this. When they came back from their honeymoon, it just ramped up and got worse and worse. And I talk about their building in the book. If you're a prominent person in New York, you probably want to have, some level of security. You want to have a doorman. You want to have, people just can't get up to you or wherever you live. They didn't have any of that. They didn't have in
Wow.
that building at 20 North Moore. They didn't have a lobby. They didn't have a doorman. There was only one way in and out of the place. So Carolyn, was really sort of a prisoner in there. She, if the paparazzi were literally camped on her doorstep every day, maybe 15 or 20. And by some accounts, they were abusive to her at times.
Hmm.
They'd yell at her, trying to elicit some sort of reaction from her. So, but anyway, John, I think overall uh, handled it pretty well. I had a quote from one of his friends. They said something like, "It must be tough to be you, live life." And he said, "Actually, I highly recommend it." So, from what I've been able to gather, there was talk about him running for the Senate seat that Senator Moynihan was retiring from. But by July, Hillary Clinton had let everybody know that she was interested in doing it. She was already on a speaking tour, and John had really stepped aside. He didn't want to. Be campaigning against her. To
Hmm.
start up his political career. It's funny, and really, I think it was the race for governor, where Governor Pataki would have been running for a third term in 2002. That's what he kind of had his eye on. If you're the senator, and Bobby Kennedy had the same experience. You're one of 100 people. If you're a hands-on guy, let's get things done. That's really not the place for you.
Hmm.
You can get it much more accomplished and sort of kick butt a lot more if you're an executive, if you're a governor. And I think that's what John had his eye on. There was also the factor that there was some issues in the marriage that may have played into it. There was also the factor of what was going on with George Magazine. George Magazine was definitely in trouble. I found the tape. There's a tape you can watch on YouTube where he's at Yankee Stadium the night before he died, and the Atlanta Braves announcer is saying, "Yeah, from reports in New York papers today say this magazine is about to go down the porcelain facility." And they had told him, Chet Filipacci had told him that they were pulling the funding on George, and he had to the end of the year to try to replace the funding, and that's what he was efforting at that time. So he wanted to at least tie up the loose ends on that and not have it go under, because that was the main thing he had undertaken in his life. And to have it go under is not really something you want on your resume if you're running for any office. It's funny, though, Stephen, people would snicker and sort of, I mean, this is before the era where, what your qualifications are for office don't matter as much as they once did. Put it that way. But people said, well, he's going to run for Senate or governor. What's his experience? And, he's just a dilettante or whatever. And then somebody said, well, would you like to be the guy that had to run against him? Just to play devil's advocate, the 21st century hasn't been great for the family politically. I mean, for the first time, there are no Kennedys serving in any public office right now. Some have run and had been successful before and weren't previously. But how far the name would have taken them in the 21st century, 40 years out from Camelot and JFK, we'll never know, of course.
Oh, I know, just a lot of folks. I'm from this, grew up in South Carolina. A lot of people of my family, boomers or whatever, who kind of grew up with the Kennedys and really connected with them for their civil rights work and so forth. There was sort of a sense of, oh wow, like our case, endorsing this guy given the history. So it was a sense of always like the Kennedys, even beyond Camelot, it was sort of, this is a wealthy, privileged family, but they use their powers for good. Perhaps that's naive, but that was how a lot of people I grew up with had kind of viewed the Kennedys. And I don't know if your experience researching the book was sort of different or whatever.
Well, one of the things I tried to show in the book is how, after this horrible cataclysm of JFK being assassinated, all of the members of the family, in some way or other, carried on his work. Jackie with the cultural side of it, which was a very important part of the Kennedy administration, really trying to uplift the cultural life of the nation. And that's something Jackie carried on for the rest of her life. Bobby, obviously, politically, was trying to carry on his work, got into really, I guess you would have to say, an unfortunate situation with Lyndon Johnson and the conduct of the Vietnam War. And we know how that turned out. But his effort was to try to carry on JFK's work. And when Bobby was killed, Ted later said that when he died, he said, "I'm going to devote the rest of my life to carrying on what he was trying to do in the world." And we see it also, obviously, with the Shriver family, with the Special Olympics, which has just gone worldwide, which is just a wonderful organization, and a lot of other ways too. And John was trying to do that. John Jr. was trying to do that in his own way with George Magazine, of getting regular people involved in politics. Politics is not a dirty word. It's very important to everything that goes on in your life. It dictates what's going on in your life. Obviously, Caroline has been ambassador now to two of our closest allies in the 21st century, Japan and Australia. So she's certainly carrying on her father's work in her own way. So that was one thing that struck me in writing this book.
Like you're talking about JFK Jr. and George Magazine, in retrospect, it felt as if it was very much ahead of its time. Now sort of what he was trying to do, like kind of make politics quote unquote sexier or more appealing to sort of now, I mean, like not even just the Daily Show, but you'll have Stephen Colbert interviewing Congress people, which I think when we were much younger, that maybe Johnny Carson would do, but that was like a regular thing of like, your talk show hosts, that sort of kind of almost celebritydom to Congress people.
He was ahead of his time with the idea of entertainment as politics and vice versa. That much is true. But I think he misread other things though too. First of all, just from a business point of view, 1999 was not the time you wanted to become a magazine.
No,
Because we know what's happened to journalism and newspapers, and nobody basically reads hard copies of things anymore. And if you don't have a hard copy, it's hard to make money on anything. And so I think he would have had a hard time no matter how good the magazine was. And really, if you look at what happened with the magazine, it was the novelty of John, this very sort of private person who hadn't really talked much about his life. The fact that he's coming out now and making this venture and being a part of it. And that lasted for a short time. But once the novelty came off, the bloom was off the rose, and their first two issues were their biggest sellers, in part because they were bundled for the advertisers. But after that, after the first couple of issues, the ad revenues began declining, and they never caught up to the point where they were losing money in their last year. So it was, in some aspects it was a good idea, and other aspects not. John had the idea that we can sort of bridge the partisan divide too, and we know that seems like a very naive idea now, even though John was one of those people that sort of was above it in a way that was respected by both sides. But that's why maybe another reason his death was tragic, is the amount of those figures that are still around are few and far between. But he was one of them. But of course, bipartisanship was becoming very passe at that time, and only increased in the decades, and has only become more so in the decades since. But still, it was successful for a short time. It was a novel idea, but it didn't really have legs. At the end, John was probably, what would have happened is he would have turned it into a web sort of magazine like Slate.
So for folks, they say, traveling to New York or interested in the history of the Kennedys, what are just a couple places that would be open to the public, obviously, that kind of still exist and would kind of give you would be an interesting spot?
Yeah, I have all the residents in the book, and I put in a warning in there. This is private property.
Exactly.
People, you don't be trespassing. I think of Central Park. Both John Jr. and Jackie love Central Park. You talk about the places that are still around. When I was writing the book, the restaurant, I'm always careful with the pronunciation of this, but Le Grenoli, I believe it was on East 52nd, right near Fifth Avenue. That was the last remaining of the great French restaurants, with both Jackie and Bobby and Ted ate there regularly. But that's now going out of business from just in the last couple of weeks. So yeah, that's too bad. That was sort of one of the last places. Public library, Jackie spent a lot of time there researching her books. You can't just walk into it, but the Carlisle Hotel, Bemelman's Bar there, and the King Cole Bar at the St. Regis Hotel. Those were some of their favorite places that are still around.
Yeah, for folks who, we call it the Mad Men era, but he was sort of, I think it is some of those places, the old supper clubs and old things of where they would sort of hang out. There is that kind of romanticism of New York that is kind of unfortunately vanishing. There's not as many of them as they once were, which is a shame.
The amazing thing, just how they live in different worlds. Like believe it, all in the month of February, within a week or two in February, Bobby Kennedy is at the premiere at the Plaza of long forgotten Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor movie, Dr. Faustus. And at the same the same month, same week or two, he's down in Kentucky meeting with some of the poorest people in the country in the Appalachian towns down there, and really speaking very empathetically with them. So, how he could talk to the, be comfortable among the richest, most famous people in the world, and a week later be talking, man to man with some of the poorest people in the world. The folk singer John Stewart from the Kingston Trio was on his campaign in 1968, and he said of Bobby, he was a man who had everything, but he cared about people with nothing. And that's a pretty good description of what he was about.
No, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us and talking about this book, which I really do recommend that people read. The book, "The Kennedys, New York: American Royalty in the Greatest City in the World." Thank you once again for joining us, Tim. And like, share, subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Steve.
Bye bye.